Thank you very much, Representative Mijatovic. Now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Jacob Mchangama. Jacob.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a profound honor to be addressing this important forum today. I especially want to thank Representative Mijatovic for inviting me, so thank you. 40 years ago, the Helsinki Final Act was adopted, committing Europe to a framework of human rights across the Iron Curtain. The Helsinki framework empowered dissidents in closed societies, giving them a voice that contributed to the defeat of totalitarianism. Among the freedoms most cherished by those dissidents was freedom of expression, as highlighted by the famous Charter 77, whose drafters complained that freedom of expression is inhibited by the centralized control of all communication and cultural institutions. But while the Helsinki Final Act ushered in a period of renewed hope and optimism by piercing the wall of censorship and repression, today the Helsinki process legacy of furthering freedom of thought, conscience and expression is being rolled back. Not by a totalitarian superpower, but by 1,000 cuts of often more sophisticated and sometimes even well-intended restrictions. And these are dark times for freedom of expression. According to Freedom House, global press freedom is at its lowest point in 10 years, with noticeable declines in Europe and Eurasia. As of 2015, by my count, 26 journalists were imprisoned in OSCE states. These, of course, include Azerbaijani investigative journalist Khadija Ismailova, sentenced to more than 7 years in prison for doing her job by exposing corruption. From 2010 to 2015, again by my count, some 21 journalists have been killed in OSCE countries, some by extremists, others seemingly with impunity and indifference from state actors. And while on paper, freedom of expression remains a cornerstone in most constitutions and indeed in international human rights law, in practice, freedom of expression is subject to an ever-expanding list of buts. And worryingly, this development affects both democracies, countries in transition, and autocracies, creating a vicious cycle and a race to the bottom on free speech. Let me try and get specific. Terrorism is a very real problem threatening innocent lives and political stability. In fact, terrorism may itself constitute a threat to freedom of expression, as we saw with the attacks against Charlie Hebdo and a free speech debate in Copenhagen, creating an assassin's veto that spreads fear and self-censorship. As such, governments obviously have a right and a duty to counter this phenomenon. But counterterrorism measures also risk erring on the side of restrictiveness. A few examples. In Denmark, a man was recently convicted for glorifying terrorism on social media for, among other things, sharing quotations from the Quran. In the UK, a woman was sentenced to 1 year in prison for downloading an Al-Qaeda magazine despite not being involved in terrorism herself. In France, more than 50 people were charged with glorification of terrorism only days after France's president and other world leaders had declared freedom of expression inviolable as a response to the Charlie Hebdo massacre. And in Turkey, 3 journalists from Vice News were recently arrested on manifestly absurd terrorism charges, with freelancer Mohammed Ismail Rasool still languishing in jail. And amid a climate increasingly hostile to independent media, Turkey's prosecutors have also launched a terror-related investigation of the Dogan Media Group. More generally, surveillance measures adopted by Western democracies have been used to target journalists and human rights defenders, affecting the ability to expose potential abuse of counterterrorism measures. A development that has enthusiastically been mimicked by more repressive states with sometimes disastrous consequences for independent media and civil society groups. I know that many of you present here today are working tirelessly to counter the evils of discrimination and racism that once again is rearing its ugly head on a continent where so much misery has been caused by ideas of national, ethnic, racial, and religious superiority. And of course, one of the most contentious issues relating to free speech is to which extent expressions that are deemed offensive or hateful should be prohibited. UN conventions, EU law, and case law from the European Court of Human Rights has made clear that international human rights law does include red lines when it comes to content. But I would argue that it's time to reconsider this approach and ask ourselves a fundamental question. Does a genuine commitment to tolerance, equality, and non-discrimination really depend on restricting the very freedom that has made possible the articulation and spread of new and progressive ideas, from religious toleration to the abolishment of slavery, the equality of the sexes, criticism of apartheid, and the rights of LGBT persons? Almost without exception, every movement fighting for progress in human affairs has been met with censorship and repression. And those who carry the torch of progress and freedom today should think twice about adopting tools of those opposed to progress, even when their intentions are pure. It also seems to me that there is very little evidence that restricting free speech helps defeat intolerance. In fact, it may be counterproductive. Let me offer you a few examples to think about. In 2010, Dutch politician Geert Wilders was on trial charged with hate speech for his well-known anti-Muslim statements. Yet 6 months later, before the conclusion of the trial, he had won 15 new seats in parliamentary elections. No doubt the publicity and opportunity to play the victim during the trial helped his appeal. The former leader of France's Front National has been convicted of incitement to hatred numerous times, and in 2013, a case was being prepared against that party's current leader. Yet Front National seems to be more popular than ever. While minorities may be hurt and offended by disparaging comments, insisting that freedom of expression be restricted to protect them from racism and offense is also a very dangerous game at a time where far-right movements with questionable commitment to liberal democracy are on the rise. It should not be forgotten that Geert Wilders wants to ban the Quran, the construction of new mosques and Islamic schools, and that Marine Le Pen wants to ban religious headwear, including the Jewish kippah. The freedoms that allow bigots to bait minorities are also the very freedoms that allow religious minorities, such as Muslims and Jews, to practice their faiths freely. By further eroding these freedoms, no one is more than a political majority away from being the target rather than the beneficiary of laws against hatred and offense. And history tells us that minorities will be first in line when political winds change for more repressive ones. In the context of the OSCE, with its diversity in member states and their form of governance, it is also important to warn against how such laws may be abused by governments to target dissenting voices. It is worth repeating the words of Eleanor Roosevelt, who during the drafting of Article 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights warned that prohibiting hate speech, quote, would encourage governments to punish all criticism under the guise of protecting against religious or national hostility. It is also worth remembering that not a single European democracy voted in favor of Article 20 in the Third Committee of the UN's General Assembly. Roosevelt's warning would soon prove prophetic. While the drafters of Charter 77, including Václav Havel, spoke of freedom and human rights, the Czechoslovakian chief prosecutor determined that the Chartists had committed a crime, quote, by clearly pursuing the aim of evoking hatred and hostility towards the socialist state system of the Republic. The danger highlighted by Roosevelt has not disappeared with the end of the Cold War. In Kazakhstan, journalist Alexander Kalamov was held in prison on remand for months and subjected to forced psychiatric evaluation after being charged with incitement to religious hatred for online atheist criticism of religion. In Russia, a woman was investigated and had her laptop confiscated for incitement to ethnic hatred after linking to documentaries on the Ukraine conflict on her social media accounts. In Belarus, human rights defenders were banned from holding a rally protesting war and political prisoners on the grounds that the rally promoted extremism and ethnic hatred. Outside Europe, the member states of the OIC are working hard to expand hate speech laws to include criticism of religion. How can these abuses be effectively countered if democracies themselves adopt vague laws against hatred and extremism, and when human rights defenders don't oppose such flagrant violations on principle, but want to draw an inherently blurred line less restrictively? The problems I have highlighted above are deepened by an incoherent patchwork of international standards and major differences in approach by international institutions. The European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, under the Council of Europe, for instance, has allowed both blasphemy bans and Holocaust denial laws as compatible with freedom of expression, and it also affords member states a wide margin of appreciation when it comes to terrorism and hate speech. The Council of Europe's Human Rights Commissioner has gone even further, proposing a Europe-wide ban on gender-based hate speech and Holocaust denial. On the other hand, the United Nations Human Rights Committee has clarified that blasphemy bans and memorial laws are incompatible with freedom of expression in Article 19 of the ICCPR, and that ratifying states must demonstrate the strict necessity of all infringements with freedom of expression. And these discrepancies matter, because differences in the protection of free speech creates loopholes and help legitimize further restrictions on freedom of expression, even if adopted in bad faith. Memorial laws provide a depressing case in point. Such laws can be used to entrench specific versions of history used to bolster those in power and marginalize opponents. In Ukraine, new laws have criminalized the denial of the crime of communism during Soviet times. Russia, on the other hand, has made it a crime to distort the role of the Soviet Union during World War II. Quite literally, one country's truth is the other country's crime. And while denying historical crimes is morally reprehensible, only academic freedom will allow historians to offer compelling evidence of past crimes that we may use to avoid repeating those crimes in the future. I'm therefore delighted to be sitting next to Representative Mijatovic, who has insisted that hate speech must be fought with more free speech, and who has resisted the call to lower the bar on the plethora of sensitive issues that make up the list of buts. If adopted internationally, such an approach would entail a much more robust protection of freedom of expression and much less leeway for those states who seek to silence criticism. Rather than new and futile attempts to ban extremism and hatred, including on social media, we should be heeding the call of Representative Mijatovic by doubling our efforts to counter the narrative of religious extremism. We should expose, criticize, and ridicule the racists and the bigots, and we should mobilize the forces of tolerance, equal citizenship, and non-discrimination. And in that great and noble endeavor, freedom of expression is part of the solution, not the problem. Thank you very much.